welcome to the Conversation Series webinar at Ahmedabad University. Today, our topic is something that is beyond COVID-19, envisioning better healthcare systems in India. This would be the fourth topic on COVID-19 that we are discussing in our conversation series, but this time we are looking beyond the crisis to look at what can we do, what can the Indian healthcare system do better now going forward. A few guidelines, I would request you to keep yourself muted and also kindly come up with your own names. It will help us in calling you when it comes towards the end for the question and answer round. And keep writing your questions in the chat box. We would be taking them up towards the end of the conversations. So I would like to welcome our guest speaker for the day, Professor Dileep Mavalankar. Professor Dileep Mavalankar is currently the director at the Indian Institute of Public Health, Gandhinagar. He's serving as the director over there since 2012. He is also the member secretary of the COVID task force at Gujarat. Professor Mavalankar is a very well-known face when it comes to managing public health in India. And his pioneering research is on improving the management of emergency obstetric care and bettering the reproductive healthcare programs and providing quality care when it comes to family welfare. Professor Mavalankar is also the chair at the technical group of for maternal health established by the Government of India, and was also a part of the mission steering committee for the National Rural Health Mission in India. Welcome once again, Professor Mavalankar.
Thank you.
In conversation with Professor Mavalankar today is Professor Vivek Tanavade, who is an associate professor at Ahmedabad University. Professor Tanavade's research focuses on stem cell cytometry and gene expression. Professor Tanavade is also associated as a mentor of the Venture Studio, which is a startup incubator at Ahmedabad University. And also he is the director and scientific advisory at iBioanalytics Private Limited in Ahmedabad. Welcome, Professor Tanavade.
Thank you, Swati.
So without further ado, I would request Professor Tanavade to begin the conversation today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Swati. And thank you, Professor Mavalankar, for joining us. This promises to be a fairly interesting conversation. We have a public health expert, a biologist, conversing with each other in a forum, a seminar organized by the School of Management. And this kind of, I think, exemplifies the interdisciplinary nature of things that Ahmedabad University endorses and espouses. So, Professor Mavalankar, you are the member secretary of the COVID task force set up by the Gujarat government. Can you tell us a little bit about the task force and what is the mandate of the task force and the role that it has played in the current pandemic?
Thank you, Professor Tanavade. The task force was constituted in roughly, I think, about 2020 June, around that time, by which the first wave of April-May had already hit, and Ahmedabad was badly affected, especially central part of Ahmedabad, and government was trying to do its best in terms of whatever was the technical guidelines, treatment guidelines, etc. As you know, the disease started reaching India in March, and then in April, more cases started happening. We had lockdown from end of March to middle of May, roughly. And the disease was new. So what to do with the cases which were coming up, how to organize? Everybody was afraid. Government was trying to get help from whatever they had, WHO, ICMR, and other technical agencies. But what government must have felt, and this is all my conjecture, that after the first wave, they thought that they would be helped if they inducted more technical experts from the outside of the government, because government already has medical colleges where there are specialist doctors. So, and they are medical teachers. So why would one get outside experts within Gujarat? So one justification was that within the government setup, unfortunately, given the underinvestment, not very forward-looking ways of working of the government, as well as overall the medical council and medical specialty development, three critical specialties needed for COVID treatment in the hospitals are generally missing from government hospitals or government medical colleges. And these are critical care management, pulmonology, and infectious diseases. So there are no departments of these within the medical colleges. And that is where, plus a good epidemiology. Of course, preventive and social medicine people are there. Unfortunately, the epidemiology is not so well developed. So that is another reason they included me from outside. I'm sort of a semi-government organization. But along with that, they also included some people who were very prominent in their field. Like we had a cardiologist, a diabetologist, and some hospital managers, like one of the persons who actually managed the COVID hospital in SVP. So she was there. So it was a mix of certain very prominent doctors, and along with that, certain specialties which are missing in the government hospitals. And that is where the role was supposed to be, giving technical advice and helping plan future actions. And as and when government requested, working on certain issues and bringing in consensus in managing the pandemic. That was the overall terms of reference. As it evolved, the meetings were organized. The health secretary was the convener or the chairman of the committee, chairperson of the committee, and I was the member secretary. So as and when government wanted, we had meetings initially in May, June, July more frequently, and later on also in September. Some of the things, the technical guidelines, and I must say that government was already consulting individual private practitioners who were specialists and well known in their field on individual basis even before the committee's formation. So, for example, Dr. Tushar Patel, who is a pulmonologist, is in the committee. He was already guiding government. He did a lot of training of government staff on how to use ventilators in March and April, actually, and May. So similarly, Dr. Atul Patel, who is infectious disease specialist, he also was involved and asked and giving advice to the government on individuals. So I think they thought that it would be better organized if a committee is formed, and that's how the committee formed. So committee advised them as and when asked. Now, two kinds of concrete things I would say committee did. One is that various issues of technical nature they develop. For example, when the issue came that hospitals are full and we need to treat patients at home and it is safe to treat patients at home. So home management guidelines were prepared by the committee of what should be done, who can be treated at home. Similarly, committee also gave advice on what medicines for clinical treatment, what kind of preventive strategies to be used, etc. They also gave advice on vaccination and other prevention. But for vaccination, there was another technical advisory committee made specifically for vaccination, which had more pediatricians, more people who have worked on vaccination, etc. So later part, I think it was done in maybe January or February, that there was a separate committee made for technical advice. The other thing it happened was, given the secretary Madam Jayanti Ravi's references, there were other invited members added beside the technical committee, which of course met. But in many of the meetings, there was a larger core group which was formed, which had a rheumatologist and UNICEF person and some of the other hospital heads which were working with government from different districts or big cities. So they were also invited. So that is how the technical committee met, looked upon various issues. In the initial months, they were almost every 15 to 20 days meeting with the they have formed the core committee. If you have read and if you have not understood, all the key secretaries and the CM's office, along with the deputy chief minister, used to meet every day at 6 p.m., including the chief secretary at chief minister's home. Almost, I think it must have started in April and maybe continued till January. So every day they had, and that is what was called core committee. And this technical committee was invited to some of the meetings of the core committee.
Right. So in hindsight, it was probably a very good idea to include a broad range of medical professionals, because when the pandemic first started, we thought it was only a lung problem. Okay? We thought that the virus infects the upper respiratory tract and then goes to the lungs. And so it was the pulmonologists who were at the forefront. A year later, we are looking at all kinds of longer term challenges, from stroke to cardiac challenges to blood clots as a result of the infection. And so I think it was a very good idea to include a broad range of professionals. So during the time that you mentioned, April 2020 to about January 2021 or even February 2021, it looked like we had conquered the disease, the virus, and our cases went up and then came down, and it wasn't probably, those numbers were not as bad as what many had expected, and even compared to the rest of the world, those numbers actually look pretty good. But then we had the second wave in March, April, May of this year, and which was much more devastating. And yes, we know that the variant was more aggressive. Yes, we know that it was easier for that variant to infect the cells from a biological perspective. But from a public health perspective, what do you think led to this second wave, which was much more worse than the first one, and what measures we could have taken to kind of mitigate it?
Yeah. So the second wave, what we call, in some sense, it was our third wave in Ahmedabad, at least, because Diwali time, if you remember, just post Diwali, we had a fairly busy time and crowded hospitals. So that could be considered a second wave, and this could be a third wave. But that apart, what your question is, and I, as an epidemiologist, I thought I will caution you. The number of cases which we are seeing in the government reported numbers in the first wave, second wave, and third wave, in some sense are not comparable, because the testing has gone up substantially.
Okay.
And as you test more, you get more cases. And that is even true in European countries, that in the early phase, last year, April, May, even in European countries, testing was limited. In Ahmedabad, I don't know, some of you may remember, I think around April and May, the government had put a restriction that you have to be admitted to a hospital to be getting an RT-PCR test. Now, if you had cold symptoms, how many people would be getting admitted to a COVID sort of designated hospital to get tested? And that remained for some time. So the testing limitations or testing numbers and conditions created some of these issues. And in hindsight, this is just in hindsight issue, that in future we should not restrict the testing. Whosoever has the machine and the reasonable technical capacity, and if kits and things are available, should be allowed to test. Because what happened is, in last year, March, April, there were only government first testing. Then only some private labs were 5 or 2 or 5 or 7 private labs. Then some another 5, 10. So those labs were getting so overcrowded. And there were other labs which could have done. It is RT-PCR, you are a biological scientist, you know it is not like rocket science in today's terms. It was rocket science 20 years ago probably, but it is now. We also did in our small research lab RT-PCR for Gandhinagar district when in the second wave. So one lesson is that don't restrict testing. You can say that, okay, you must report the numbers, whatever else you want to do, because access to treatment was based on testing. So unless you test, you can't get treatment. If you can't get treatment, then your chance of survival is lower. So looking at all of that, you are saying why we had this second wave, and it is enigma, not very clear, except one thing is clear, that new strain Delta, which came, which was highly infectious, and that could have led. But why would the counter argument is, if it was only because of the Delta, did our behavior change so much in the first? Of course, first wave was muted because of the lockdown, severe lockdown in April, May. So that was clear. Second wave in September, and then in November, lockdowns were opening gradually, so people were following. So some part is also because of people's behavior. But the other side is that along with that, some vaccination happened by April, not a whole lot, but some vaccination had happened. People at least knew how the disease is transmitted, how to protect. So it was not lack of probably awareness, but lack of care or lack of proper precautions, which is a second major reason why this second wave happened. Third reason, not of the wave, of course, behavior is how infection spread, but some of the nature of the virus had changed, in the sense, along with increasing infectivity, what we saw in the first wave, even though the virus was highly infectious, what is called a secondary attack rate, which is how many secondary cases developed after one case develops in your own family. And that attack rate, surprisingly, and when we calculated, we were quite surprised, and then we saw the literature also endorse it, was somewhere about 10%. So for example, you 10 to 20%. So you have a household of 5 or 6 people, one person develops the infection. Of course, it takes 2-3 days for people to realize that they may have COVID. It takes 1 day for testing. And if you are very agile, 3rd, 4th day, you may isolate the person. So he is spreading the disease for 4 days in the house, but only one more person gets infected on an average out of 5-6 susceptible people in the first wave. So which was surprising, that secondary attack rate is not very high. So in spite of highly infectious agent, secondary attack rate was low. But in the second wave, the secondary attack rate, we haven't calculated because we hadn't had the data, but quite a bit of reporting saying whole families were involved, right, in much larger proportion than the first. So there was also something related to infectiousness of the virus which had changed. So these are the reasons why second wave seemed to be much more deadly. The other thing is that it happened in the first wave. What had happened was, it first started in Ahmedabad, then reached Surat, then reached Rajkot, then reached Jamnagar. So there was a temporal shift, and government could shift staff from one medical college to another to deal with that city. But in the second wave, all the cities almost and also rural area had spread. And that is where the whole this medical infrastructure getting choked up, beds not available, ICU not available, etc. happened.
So if one looks at the number of deaths that happened, again, there was a difference in the number of deaths that we had in, let's say, April, May of 2020 versus April, May of 2021. And this has been a very controversial topic. It is heavily debated in the press as well. There have been some opinions that says that we are underreporting the number of deaths due to various reasons, including the fact that people may not have gone or been able to go to a hospital where a death would be registered as a COVID death. And there was also arguments in terms of looking at the case fatality ratios and the and really that being an indicator for public policymakers of when we should reopen from a lockdown or when we should start once what kind of activities should start once those numbers come down. So again, as a public health professional and as an epidemiologist, what do you think is the importance of looking at the number of fatalities caused by the disease versus the number of severely ill patients but who managed to survive versus people who had a mild form of the disease and were able to recover relatively quickly, and what can we kind of do to then try and see if they go towards the mild form rather than death?
Yeah. So I think this very important question. Let me counter question you, saying if it was seen in early phase of COVID pandemic that the mortality was not very different from common flu, then what would have happened? It may be new virus, but if the mortality and morbidity or hospitalization was not very different, or maybe 5, 10, 20% more than common flu, which many people argued at that time. If you hear some of the
early January of 2020, this is what people
US,
thought, that this is
and
like
many
the flu.
people argued.
Yeah.
So then what would have happened? It would nothing would have happened. We would have been no lockdown, no nothing. So the difference is not that it is new. Difference is, of course, it is new, but it has higher morbidity and mortality. So in some sense, in any epidemic or any new disease, any old disease, re-emerging disease, what is important is morbidity and mortality. Not that it is new and how many people get infected. So that I think we must understand, and as a public policy makers accept that that is the differentiating factor between a deadly disease and not deadly disease. Now, somehow in our country, death because of an infectious disease, and that too also like novel infectious disease, become highly political. And that is why the management of numbers starts happening in some sense, officially, unofficially. Second part is our death reporting is very, very poor. And I had asked your permission to show just one slide. So if you permit, I want to show to the audience. Some of them may have seen this slide, but let me show you this slide, which is taken from internet. You can read about it more when you get. If you haven't read, I should spend 2 minutes to tell you what is this. It is from another presentation. Don't look at the title, but this is what is called as Bills of Mortality of London. If you search on internet, Bills of Mortality of London, you will find these things. On the left side, you see a cover page of the year 1664, beginning 27th of December 1664 and ending 19th of December the following year. So this is 64 to 65, mainly 65, 1665 years London's mortality record cover page. Inside, you see the cause of death. This is old English, so you cannot easily read, but deaths and causes, casualties by week. This is cause of death. If you see here, look, what is the cause of death? Grief is identified as cause. Somebody had so much grief, there is some jaundice, there is some infants dying. And if you read here, this line, it is plague. 6,544 people died of plague on 1 week. And that week is 12th September to 19th September. So in London and some parts of European city, they had made a system of counting all the deaths for the week, totaling them up, analyzing by cause, printing the report and selling it for 4 pence for anybody who wanted for each week on the following Wednesday. That was the systematic analysis of death available in London in 1600s, middle of 1600s. Now, today, how do we count deaths in India? We count like this: how many bodies are floating somewhere, how many fires are being burned, some drone picture, somebody media showing, etc., etc. And our official death counters, which are called registrars of birth and death. The British also left us that gift. Their birth and death registration acts were copied from Britain, but unfortunately, we haven't understood the importance of death registration and cause of death analysis. And that is where all this problem arose, that we don't know how many people died of COVID. The second is, we didn't want to know how many total people died in Ahmedabad. I'll ask you a question. Suppose the total deaths in Ahmedabad are known. Normally, every day there are about 100 to 150 deaths. And we exactly knew that people not more than 150 are dying every day in Ahmedabad. But there are many COVID deaths. Then still we would not have been so much, because it is somebody else was going to die by this reason. Probably he died a little bit younger by that reason.
Right.
So it is not a major problem as a society. But if instead of 150 deaths, if 300 people died in a day or 500 people died in a day, and that happened, not in COVID, I don't know, likely to have happened given the crematorium queues and all. But we have shown this. It has happened in chikungunya epidemic of 2006, which we investigated from birth and death record, and showed that just in 4 months, more than 3,000 additional deaths happened during the chikungunya epidemic. And still government, WHO, everybody said nobody dies of chikungunya. So to monitor gross mortality, even without cause, is very, very useful. I call it a barometer of a city's or country's health. If you can show that India's gross death rate has not increased, then I'm not worried. I'm worried because there is one important cause which could have been prevented. But if it comes out that India's gross mortality had doubled, and chikungunya, COVID contributed only 10% to that, then as a public health professional, the question remains that why did the 90% of the people die additionally? So the additional death concept, which is also still tabulated in Europe. If you search a website called Euromomo, you will find it. It is a weekly mortality analysis of all European countries as compared to expected deaths. So these two things we did not do. What data are available every day in India? How many tests done? How many tests positive? And how many deaths? These are useful. But the deaths data we don't have is how many hospitalized. So how many severe cases? And secondly, how many gross mortality of any city, ward, area, village, etc. And that is where our mortality recording and analysis system has failed. In the budget, there was no money put that to improve mortality reporting system. There is no chief. The Registrar General of Birth and Death of India did not speak at all. In this whole 1 year, I have not seen any statement. Any city registrar of death and birth, Bombay has, Ahmedabad has, Nagpur has, they also didn't produce. The state registrar of birth and death didn't disclose any data. So that is a major shortcoming and should not happen. And like the temperature data of yesterday is available in today's newspaper, I have been telling, since we have done some heat related work, we will talk about it at some point. But if you report that yesterday 150 people died in Ahmedabad, whatever, cause may not be known, but I am okay. But if I read in the newspaper, like if I know in the newspaper in summer that it is 42 degrees temperature, I said it is okay, normal summer. But if I read in the newspaper 47 degrees, then I am worried that it is very severe heat wave.
So this baseline data is available over time for temperature.
Yeah, it is what the meteorology department does is it calculates the average of 30 years of temperature, rain, humidity for that particular day in the year and puts that as an expected number. And what is the deviation from the expected number? So that is what we need to do. And that is not a rocket science. That is why I showed you the slide of mortality analysis of London of 1664, 65.
So I think going forward, this would be an important lesson for us in terms of generating and maintaining this baseline data in terms of number of deaths, which is accurate, because I think the challenge really is to implement this in an accurate manner. And if half the deaths don't get reported, then even if you have the data, it is not of much use because we're not really capturing every single death that kind of happens.
The other side is that we have also not understood the importance of demographer. See, all this birth and death data is to be kept by a demographer. That is the population sciences job. But no city employs a demographer. We don't have a national demographer. We have a census commissioner. So census, Britishers told us, they taught us, and we are doing it mechanically since then for 150 years. But we didn't pick up birth and death registration. See, this less and less number of female children being born. Why are we waking up so late? We should have woken up 10, 15 years, 20 years ago. If we had good recording of all births by sex, analysis would have shown that less and less baby girls are getting born. So we haven't as a nation understood the importance of demography. And that is where our birth and death and vital statistics or health statistics, population statistics, whatever you want to call it.
So that brings me to the question that is on everyone's mind today. I mean, you hear this question often in all sorts of WhatsApp forwards that one gets and in the news media, and that is about the next wave. Okay, the third wave, the fourth wave, or whatever the way we want to call it. Now, as I understand, this is going to be impacted by primarily two determinants. One is whether there will be even more aggressive variant of the virus that could develop as a result of mutations. We're already talking about the Delta Plus variant. I must say that that's another area where, countries like the UK have shown that if you're able to sequence most of the patient, the virus isolates from most of the patients, or at least a high number of patients, then this information is available. In a country like India, even those numbers are based on a relatively small proportion of the total infected individuals, because we aren't really able to sequence that many. So that is one determinant. And of course, the second is the availability of the vaccine and how quickly we can vaccinate our large population, which is a mammoth task in itself. So what are your views on whether a next wave will come, and what can we do to kind of make sure that that never happens?
Yeah. So I think there are three things we can do. One is, of course, improve or accelerate vaccination as much as possible, which the constraining step, there are two things. One is, of course, vaccine availability. Second is vaccine resistance, in the sense how many people in the rural areas, etc., have a lot of unfounded beliefs about need for vaccine, not having a need for vaccination, and side effects and fear of vaccination. So how to overcome that? So the main problem is how to have enough vaccine doses. And there, in some sense, we have missed several stations of the train. We could have planned from last July. And I would go because it's a research institute and some of the biology students are there, faculty. I'm thinking of writing something. Even our clinical testing trial protocols need to be relooked at. For example, the phase 3 trial is done in a community setting.
Right.
Now, in the community setting where we started doing in June, July, I think, phase 3 trials for most of the vaccine. Now, community setting, that time the cases were going down. So the rate of infection is much lower. So one of my learning or lesson or question to the immunologist and to the vaccine trial people are, why not do the testing in medical staff attending the COVID patients?
Mhm.
Of course, voluntarily, not by force, but as volunteer, because their chance of getting infected is, we are saying 10 times higher or 9 times, 10 times higher. So what it means is that you require 10 times lower number of cases for efficacy side. Safety side, okay, you need 30,000 people, you need 30,000 people for safety. But for efficacy, if we had tested in medical staff, we would have gotten the results in 3 months instead of 6, 8, 9, 10 months of third phase trial going on. So that is one lesson for trials to be done in an area where there is a lot of transmission. Second is, of course, we should have booked, we should have expanded, we should have paid money. All of that is gone. We can't do much. So one side for the prevention of third phase is how many additional vaccines, how fast can we approve through our due diligence process. In the initial part of January, I had written or did some analysis of the available secondary data. India has about 740 districts by then now. And out of that, if you took the topmost 50 districts, which is just 6% of the districts, they had 60% of the cases and 60% of the deaths, roughly. So my strategy for vaccination would have been first vaccinate only those 60 districts, not the whole country. What we did was 60 years and above. So the risk of a person living 60 years and above in Bombay, Ahmedabad, Surat, Delhi is much different than a rural Meghalaya 60-year-old person. Age is important once you get the infection, but the chance of getting infection for a 45 years of person in Bombay, Bangalore or Ahmedabad, much higher than in a rural, in the first wave, I'm saying. Second wave, many things changed. So we could have done, and no country has done it. Unfortunately, every country, so England did it, so we also did 60, 50, etc., etc. So I think, what is the vaccination purpose? Is it to just protect the old people, or is it to stop the transmission wherever it is happening? So I think I haven't seen adequate discussion on what is, given we have limited vaccine. If we had unlimited vaccine, it's a different issue. And still, the resistance to rural people taking vaccine is because they have not seen, in the second wave it changed, but they had not seen cases dying. Why did doctors themselves don't take the vaccine? In the first month, it was only open to medical staff. Only half of the medical staff took the vaccine. So there is also a lot of unspoken unwillingness to experiment with anything new. So I think that we have to keep in mind and counter it. I'm not saying that that is uncounterable or Recently,
So
I
this
heard.
would be an interesting problem for sociologists, for example.
Yeah. Recently, I heard a very interesting anecdote from people working. We had a webinar yesterday. In tribal areas, there were a lot of resistance to vaccine so far. But in the last 15 days, they started coming forward for vaccination suddenly. So these people who are working in tribal area very surprised. What happened? When they informally investigated, they said there was a rumor that if you don't get vaccination certificate, you will not get your ration through your ration shops. And that is why, and even on TV, it was reported when the day when India reached 80 lakh, Indore district did some 2 lakh vaccination out of that. And that was partly because of this informal instruction from the collector saying, tell the people that they will not get government benefits if they don't take vaccine. So all of these types of things also have happened. So beside that, so the second is behavior. So one is vaccine, but it is limited by our supplies. And the more vaccine we authorize, the more vaccine we get, it will be better. Second is our behavior. Somehow, because lockdown has gone, many people think that the disease has gone and people are not really following the social distancing norms. In the second wave preceding that, there were all these election rallies and many things, political, religious festivals, Kumbh Mela, you name it, even marriages. I was talking to somebody in Maharashtra. People said there were thousands of people in marriages in Nagpur, Bombay, Pune in November, December, January, because that's the marriage season, in spite of having a ban on more than 200 people or something like that. So that was another reason. So if we don't behave, the virus will not leave us very easily. So virus has no mercy to those who don't behave. The third is there are other factors which are very less explored and mired in controversy, but nobody doing large trials. For example, strong evidence that if you have adequate vitamin D in your body, you don't get COVID, or if you get COVID, it is very mild. Now, vitamin D is quite cheap. If you don't have money, you just stand in the sunlight for half an hour, you get adequate vitamin D. And that is the reason probably the poor people don't have so much bad COVID, because otherwise we did some analysis on COVID in slums, and some of you can take it up if you're working on some slums. What we find is it was 10 times less incidence in one of the slums where we got the data than the middle class colonies which are surrounding the slum in the same ward. Now, why would a slum which doesn't have water to hand wash, doesn't have sanitization, cannot do social distancing because it is crowded, cannot wear or do not wear the mask? So all the three precautions in the slum are not possible or not done. And in spite of that, they don't have so many cases or deaths. Now, what does it explain? So there is some things, either there are, my hypothesis is, of course, vitamin D is known hypothesis. Second is they repeatedly get various other infections which boost their general immunity. And that is where they are also resistant to corona. If you look at the data coming out from Dharavi, when Dharavi infection started happening, people were very worried that this is like an atom bomb. Thousands and thousands will die. Nothing like that happened. There were in the first phase, only 3,000 cases out of 10 lakh population.
Right.
And they said it is very successful control of the disease in Dharavi by Mumbai Corporation. They may have done it, but the following that sero surveillance showed that 57% of Dharavi, that means 5,70,000 people were infected. So the ratio of infection to mortality, disease was also very less in the slum population. So that is another, like we should do trials or some more research on vitamin D. Maybe ivermectin is another such controversial thing, which is many people very strongly believe, but all these big agencies are still not convinced of that. So these are the other methods we can prevent besides vaccine, our COVID appropriate behavior.
So let's now shift gears and talk about the healthcare system in India. I mean, I think one of the learnings from the pandemic has been that there is increased awareness about the healthcare system that we have, the expenditure on healthcare that we have as a country, and whether that is adequate or not. And then I see some questions in the chat box also regarding this. So the question uh, is our current healthcare system broken? Do we need to fundamentally change it? And there is this concept of universal health coverage, that is healthcare for all, espoused by many other countries, and that's a goal that many countries are working towards. So, do you think universal health coverage is possible, or should be, a goal for a country like India?
Yeah. So what are the lessons for improving our healthcare system? One is that, of course, we saw, especially in the second wave, how inadequate our healthcare system was. And when we say healthcare system, we should separate two parts of it. One is sickness care system. Once you are sick, how much care is available, how many hospitals, beds, ventilator, oxygen, remdesivir, etc. is sickness care. Second is what is our prevention, community behavior, sanitation, water supply, education, etc., etc. What prevention? So our sickness care is also weak, in the sense not adequate, especially freely available in the public system, and the sickness prevention system is also weak. And both of these systems we need to build up. The other question you asked, data are not coming, and it is very fertile ground for research for how much expenditure did India do on COVID. We are measuring how much GDP loss is there. But individually, if you look at the bills of the private hospitals, they vary from 50,000, maybe the minimum, to 2 crores, 1 crore. No, 1 crore. One of our faculty members' relative in Delhi, in big hospital, for 1 month, he was in the ventilator or something. That was 50-60 lakh rupees of bill. Right. So, because once in big hospital, it is 1 lakh rupee a day, roughly, on a ventilator or some such things. So what I'm trying to say is that measuring the economic loss or loss of savings of families, it is unbelievable. And that is where the importance of universal health care comes, that nobody should be able to not afford, or at least those who can't afford shouldn't be denied of care. And that is where I hope that we will learn a big lesson from this and ramp up our healthcare provision, sickness care provision and preventive care provision, both. Because, for example, we don't have a public health cadre. There are very few public health officers in the big cities, some in rural areas, but they also do clinical work. They do also other work. So we need to develop a really strong preventive care or public health kind of a system, along with a strong outpatient, inpatient, and critical care system. And it is just, you need to see to believe how much investment England, Sweden, Germany, Western countries have done in providing free care to its citizens. Unbelievable amounts of money and thought and political commitment goes in providing sickness care and health care both. So which we are in some sense very far off from that level. And of course we can move. It is not that it is a political decision of where to spend the resources. And if I had thought, I would have shown you a slide of Taj Mahal and told you a story. If there is time permitting, I'll tell you at the end.
Sure. So this kind of brings me to an interesting point, and that is different countries have different healthcare models. And the question that is often asked in all of these countries and I myself have experienced it in 3 different countries, is that who pays for healthcare, who pays for this? And the argument that I've heard made in our country is that this is simply too expensive for us to afford. Okay, that maybe developed countries like England and Sweden and the Scandinavian countries can do that. To a certain extent, the US is still grappling with this question again with every successive president. But we, as India as a country, we can't afford to pay for this. This is a luxury that we cannot afford. I think the pandemic has taught us that the economic cost of not paying for this is far greater than paying for it. And so it is okay to have a few hospitals which have the best trained doctors and which can rack up a bill of a couple of lakh rupees. But the challenge is most people can't afford it. And so there has to be equity in healthcare, especially if we look at it from an infectious disease, because the virus doesn't really distinguish between the rich and the poor. And so what are your thoughts about how do we get equity in our healthcare system?
Yeah. My sense is equity has to come in our thinking first. Unfortunately, India is a very hierarchical system. And in some sense, I don't know what brought the equity thinking in Europe, Western Europe. One historians might be able to tell us better. But we need to think that everybody must have equal access to the core functions or core things of any modern society, which is education, health, other welfare measures. Unfortunately, that is not there in our country, and I don't see it coming. But in Europe, there was an old philosopher, old meaning in the, I think, 1300s or something, called Virkov or Firkov, from somewhere in Germany or Prussia that time. He had a very interesting argument why kings should invest in people's health. And that argument is worth understanding for the logic of it. And he says, what is king's duty? That time king's duty was to have an army and police and all, so that the raiders from outside, because Europe was full of small kingdoms, raiders from outside, invaders from outside that did not invade the cities or areas and plunder all the wealth created by the rich people or the people who did work. So he said that is one job of the king. So, but what is the wealth of the poor man? Because there were some rich men who had big houses, but there are lots of poor men who were doing agriculture labor, some cobblery work, something. So he said their wealth. So if the king's job is to protect the wealth of the rich, the king's job is to protect the wealth of the poor. Now, what is the wealth of the poor? The wealth of the poor is their ability to produce labor. And their ability to produce labor depends on their health. If they are sick, they cannot produce labor, they cannot earn. So he said their health is their wealth. And that is why king must protect the health of the people. And that is why they created a term called social medicine or equality for health. And if you go to Germany, some of you, if you haven't read about German health system, I think it is one of the most equitable. Of course, it is breaking down. It is not sustainable. They are finding it difficult, but unbelievable kinds of equity are inbuilt in that system. So one is first a mindset change. Second is valuing that investing in health really produces return. And there are economic other arguments, calculations saying $1 invested in this type of health gives you $16 of return. $1 invested in this type of health gives you $5 of return. So that's also all worked out. But somehow our public health and other people are not able to convince the government to invest on a large scale for the general public. And one of the reasons of that is because the government health capacity is captured by politicians, officers of the government employees. So they are never at trouble. They never have to wait. Like you have seen People may be waiting in Delhi, but any minister falling sick, there is always room in All India Institute of Medical Sciences for them to go in, even though if they don't need admission. So that is another. Professor Samuel Paul, who was director of IIN many years ago, then with the World Bank, and then set up this public affairs center or something in Bangalore, unfortunately no more, had this thing developed of the idea that if the services are captured by the elite and they don't suffer. Why did Europe develop? Because there was no antibiotics. So if you fall sick, your chance of survival of a rich or poor man was almost the same. So you better improve your environment. That's why they invested in public health, other improved water supply, improved quality of life, garbage clearance, because infection disease would kill even the rich people. Unfortunately, we are in a development phase where rich people can protect themselves by private medicine and antibiotics, so they don't suffer. They can drink bottled water. So if the city water is unclean, they are not affected.
Right. So essentially what this says is that we really need metrics for gauging the level of healthcare across all social strata, and it is only not only the rich that we need to benefit, but equitable healthcare is important, because otherwise, in a situation like the pandemic, everybody gets affected. And so, what are really the social determinants of health? And can you give us some example of how these social determinants of health can be measured?
Yeah. So I started giving some examples. Let's take the example of water,
Right.
clean water supply. So what is social determinants of health, which are not biological? Like your age, your sex is somewhat biologically determined. But social determinants are everything around, which is developed or woven across you by the society, and it affects health. So water is a very important social determinant of health, that if you don't have clean water through the municipal system or through whatever other systems, then you will fall sick. And that will lead to social personal loss as well as social loss. Similarly, air pollution. If Delhi is a highly Delhi air is polluted, the rich people might get some protection by air purifiers, but not a whole lot. You can't have all the air you breathe. So it is in some sense very leveler type of social determinant. So cities have to do something for air pollution. So these are the factors like water, air, food, other environmental factors, mosquito control, etc. are all social. Second is access to care. As we discussed, suppose you are a poor person, then only access to care is through the government system, which is free. You can't go to the private system. And that is where insurance or social health insurance comes, that whether you go to private or public, as long as you get care without having to pay for it, and care is of reasonable quality, that is fine. It doesn't have to be government hospitals. Sometimes what happens is people misinterpret, saying, oh, that means you must have big government hospitals. That is not what is needed. For example, take example of Britain, where you have all the GPs are free to the British public. Right. But they are not government employees. They are contracted by government to provide care to the citizens. So you don't need a government system. And that was the turning point of China from its socialistic and communist thinking to free market. And one sentence which became then very famous, I want to repeat, of Deng Xiaoping. He said at that time, whether the cat is black or white, I don't mind as long as it catches the mice. Right. So whether the provider is public or private, as long as it provides care to the person and the person doesn't have to pay, it is fine. It is the same system as in Germany. There are many private doctors who provide care on outpatient basis, which are paid by the sickness funds or the social health insurance. So I think social determinants are very, very powerful long-term determinants of health. And if you look at history of many diseases, for example, TB mortality decline in the Western countries, there's a very famous graph which many public health people have seen. TB mortality started declining in 1900s in Western Europe and US when the social conditions improved, whereas TB medicine came only after 1950. And after that, the mortality decline is neither faster nor slower. So the social determinants were as effective in declining TB before the medicines came.
Right. So then the question is, as a country, what is India doing in terms of trying to, achieve these social determinants of health, in trying to improve these social determinants of health? Sanitation, nutrition is another thing that came up in the chat box. Water, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So I think these are the 2-3 things we have been doing. Of course, sanitation was one major effort. Now we have Nal Se Jal, so each house should have a tap. So water from the tap, which in some sense we should, at least in the middle class, upper middle class, we assume, but not everywhere, and many houses don't have that. So availability of water, sanitation, clean air in the cities, reasonably good nutrition at affordable prices. So all that is, even our PDS system, public distribution system, is a social determinant. If you don't have food, you will not be able to maintain your health. So all the measures which we do, they are social determinants. Only thing is, we need much more focus, much more investment. Of course, certain societies do it, certain societies still take it as a private good or as a thing only for the poor. And that is where the problem is, that even in Gujarat, we have seen the numbers that the food packets which are given free from Anganwadi, which is called Balbhog and take-home ration, out of 80% families who receive it, only 30% or 25% use it for the beneficiary. Another 25% use it for the whole family. And rest of the 50% don't even use it. So that is another issue. So it's not only provisioning, but proper use of the provisioning so that the targeted benefit is reached.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Professor Mavalankar. So this was a very, very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. And I think we are getting towards the close of the discussion, but there are lots of questions from the audience that have been coming up in the chat box. And I'll hand it over to Swati for managing and asking some of those questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Mavalankar and Professor Tanavade. Yes, while you both were having the conversation, we were bombarded with a lot of questions and comments and insights from our audience. So we're thinking to invite a few of them on camera to ask directly from Professor Mavalankar. I would request Professor Darshini Mahadevia, if you can come on the video. Yeah, she's here. Yes.
Yeah, how are you, Professor Mavalankar? Dilip Bhai was a member of our committee when we did the Gujarat Human Development Report. And since then, there's been some close connection with him. So there are two things, actually, our audience had this question on also Vivek asked on the social aspects of it. Health is largely, largely healthcare can be handled to preventive healthcare, and which is largely based on your social aspects and public policy. And that's where I think which we have been missing. It's basically sanitation, that is water, sewerage system, and solid waste management, garbage lifting. And I think we are falling short on garbage management really very badly, and also on good quality water supply. The second is very, very important is nutrition. Although we have had very long programs on nutrition from nutrition of the mother to child nutrition, I think we still are really poor in terms of infant mortality rates, because we still have a long way to go. And one of the important reasons that is being argued about in this is very poor quality of women's health. Because once the women's health is poor, because they're very highly malnourished, stunted women in India, and that gets carried forward to the child. And I think that's where major emphasis should be. Dr. Mavlankar did talk about improvement in various morbidities across the world before even the medicines were found. And this where the improvement in not just life quality and ability to buy better nutrition food, but also improvement in public healthcare expenditure. Today's paper tells us that India is spending 1% of its GDP on public health, on healthcare. And we've been monitoring this, looking at this data now for a long time. And that 1% is there for now last 20 years. And what we see, if we look at the graphs of other countries, as the per capita income increases, the percentage allocation of GDP to healthcare increases. And that's not taken place in India now for last at least 2 decades. There's been this it's a very well-known debate in India that in spite of high growth rates that we saw post-economic reform, especially in the decades of 2000 to 2012, there's been abysmal allocation to healthcare. And Gujarat is an example where you have much higher per capita state domestic product, but the allocation to healthcare, and I think Dilip bhai, we have been having this argument on Gujarat's healthcare now for a long, long time. And so there is a long, long agenda for us to work on healthcare. And my question to Dilip bhai is that now what if we have another, not just COVID, but any other pandemic? How are we going to manage that? Now, today we hear Zika virus coming up in Kerala. It had come in Gujarat as well. And pandemics are going to be coming up because of multiple reasons, in one of them being climate change. So how are we going to handle that coming in future?
Yeah, I think you have raised many important issues. One is, of course, why we are stuck at 1%, which is, I like an answer given by a preventive medicine person in Africa. We say that there is no political commitment to health. But his answer was, as public health people, we don't have the political skills to make that political will come through. So in some sense, we have to learn the political skills which are required to increase the allocations. By calculating everything and showing in professional journals, it might not bring about. So we have to learn the political skills required to increase. I give this example, and some of you may be connected, so don't get offended. Each BRTS bus stop cost about 1 crore rupees. Nobody asked, why should a bus stop cost 1 crore? It used to be 75 lakhs when I started asking question. Now I understand, because there is stainless steel pipes being put inside and all fancy design and whatever. You stand 15 minutes for a bus or 20 minutes, but still it costs. And in 1 crore, you can build an urban health center of very nice quality. And we did build one in Vasna. So my sense is, even I have seen in Delhi also, they are putting stainless steel pipes in the bus stop. Why can't you put stainless steel water pipes? Water pipes, you are using the still old, which will get corroded. So my sense is, our engineering people also need to really rethink. Today we saw this news saying Chinese lamp post of some 20 lakh rupees is a one lamp post. That in that much we built the health center. So if we really are worried about health, and if we, so what I am coming to after all the 30-40 years of research is, we need really sort of political activism to work to increase the health resources in various ways, and we have to find who are the allies who will be able to do that. Second is, you were asking about nutrition, which is in some sense a major issue, and nutrition is not a health issue, it is a cross-cutting issue of women, children, men, everybody as a society. Are we ensuring adequate access to food, adequate knowledge about food? and adequate provision to those who cannot afford to eat good food. The other side of nutrition is also worrying. So it is not only malnutrition of the undernutrition type. Malnutrition has two tails. One is overnutrition, which is also very rapidly building up in our cities, and that is where we had these all comorbid people with diabetes, hypertension, you name it, and overweight, which led to high mortality. And that's why in big cities like New York, London, there was very high mortality of COVID because there are a lot of comorbid people there. So in some sense, we have to ensure that food becomes an important issue, and we measure it, how well it is getting there, how well, what are the problems of not getting the food, what are the, and given now this whole cycle of price escalation, post-COVID, we may be even in a very bad nutritional situation. We hope that we don't reach the levels of malnutrition which are seen in a country with famine, because many people who are out of job may be not having food. So emergency provisions may be required on a large scale. Of course, country is trying to do. Some 80 crore people are going to get at least some food available. One thing which Government of India should add, and as a public health professional, and it is a very low cost, is through the PDS system, give a multivitamin tablet. One tablet every day. It will cost about 25 to 50 paise per person per day. Because giving macronutrients is one side of nutrition. You must have vitamins, minerals, etc. And given our poor quality of diet, you can't expect. So my view and vision is that government must give multivitamin tablet to everybody. Some people may not like it. Some people may like it to get it from green leafy vegetables and carrots and all. But in a practical world, for the poor people, that is not a choice. And micronutrient deficiencies can lead to many diseases, illness, lack of immunity, tiredness, inability to produce labor, work, etc., etc. So this can be separated as a separate nutritional micronutrient deficiency is another issue which we need to really think with the overall food issue.
Thank you, Professor Mavlankar, and thank you, Professor Mahadevia, for your question. To some extent, I think our Anganwadi workers are doing a good job in providing at least some nutritional food to the rural sector. So we also have Gunjan Trivedi with us. He's the co-founder of Wellness Space. Sir, may I invite you to ask your question? May I invite you on camera? It seems that he's not there right now, so I'll take the opportunity to ask the question that he had posted. So, sir, Mr. Trivedi had asked that about COVID-19 and its impact on mental health. So, India's 1% budget is on mental health, and 1 out of 7 Indian needs mental health treatment. So, how can this imbalance be addressed out in our future healthcare framework?
Yeah, I think mental health is another such unaddressed issues which will come up, has already been discussed now with COVID and isolation and death and loss of income, etc. So this is the right time to also start asking for more and more provision for mental health. Only thing is, one has to be careful that we don't go the route which Western country did by building more and more bigger and bigger mental hospitals. So we should, one is develop some innovative solutions at a low cost to ensure mental health or mental well-being. And how can we use the digital technology? How can we use other mechanisms to provide support to people who are not mentally well or need help related to pandemic and related to many other things. So this is another major public health area which is under developed, under investigated, under invested. Can I answer one question which I am seeing? I'm tempted to answer. Jimol
yes,
and
please.
Darshini has written. There are many unnoticed increase in morbidity of health burden of people which may not have tested and reported because of the lockdowns and because of the many restrictions or non-availability of doctors. There are many diseases which doctors are now seeing in an advanced stage, especially cancer, cataract, etc. If they were not picked up early, they become more complicated. And we did a small study with a student in a private lab, just tabulated his cancer samples coming, and it dropped substantially, more than 70% in last year, April, May, and then gradually now only they are picking up. So what has happened is many cold conditions which are not emergency were not addressed, and that burden will now start showing up in the subsequent years. Second is this disease itself, many people have argued it is not a pulmonary disease, it is a vascular pulmonary disease. So there are many vascular or blood vessel manifestations, which means that heart attacks, strokes, kidney failure. You must have read, I also didn't know, mesenteric, intestines dying inside the abdomen because the main arteries supplying the intestines get blocked. So all kinds of things could happen because of the clotting disturbance that this virus causes. Another question is, what about Taj Mahal story? So if you permit, I want to show one more slide and maybe tell the Taj Mahal story. On the left hand side is the Taj Mahal, you see. On the right hand side is the Swedish Queen. So first start with the Taj Mahal was built because the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, in the memory of his wife Mumtaz Mahal, who died in the 14th childbirth in Behranpur in Madhya Pradesh in 1632 AD. He was so much moved that he spent all his publicly earned money, in the sense king's own khajana or treasure or treasury, to build this such a beautiful Taj Mahal. Around the same time, around this 1630 or 50, this Queen of Sweden, Sweden was also a very large poor country in Europe. They did not have much development, only agricultural and wood related. She developed very difficult pregnancy. Her pregnancy was very delicate and complicated. There was nobody in Sweden who could help her. So the king had to send for doctors from France to come, because France were more developed obstetrics care available, delivery care. Doctors for France were called, and they helped the queen, and queen survived, the baby survived. But the king was so humiliated. He said, why can't my people cannot do this what French did? So he sent this chief doctor of Sweden that time, John Varun or something is his name, to go to France, learn midwifery, come back and train rural midwives. This is a rural midwives kit in Sweden in the 1600s, 1700s. And he mandated that each town must employ a government-funded midwife who will be trained in Stockholm and will invest or will do deliveries. And that is why Sweden's maternal mortality is 1 or 2 per 100,000 births, whereas we are at 100 per 100,000 births. So the moral of the lesson is Sweden invested in human resource development for health. They didn't build Taj Mahal. He could have built another mansion of his own. But the mental philosophy or king's inclination were different. So Sweden has world's best midwives, world's best healthcare system. But we have Taj Mahal. So if Swedish want to come, they have to come here to see Taj Mahal. If we have to learn midwifery, we have to go to Sweden to learn midwifery. So whatever social investment we make will give us the results of what kind of society we want. So that is where this Taj Mahal syndrome I have given. We are still building Taj Mahals. and not investing enough in our education, health, other social services. So that is where this story becomes important.
Thank you for showing this contrasting picture and this interesting story. So we have Dr. Danish Ahmed with us. So would you like to come on camera and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So thank you, Professor Mavlankar. It's always been a pleasure to listen to you, and you explain so clearly and so patiently. So most of my questions I think you've answered, but I had one question which I may like to ask, and it relates to our public memory of diseases. India has already had many infectious diseases which causes a lot of deaths. For example, tuberculosis. And COVID right now is very much present in our public memory. But with the passing of time, it's quite likely that we are going to forget that the impact it has had. So I wanted to know from your sense, Professor Mavlankar, what do you think needs to be done so that the key lessons out of COVID remain in the public sphere? And in one sense, as a voter, if a politician was ever going to come to me, I think as people, we need to demand not just roti, kapda, makan, and mobile, which has been added, but also vaccine and better healthcare. So thank you.
Yeah. So I think interesting question. How do we remind the voters, or how do we remind the society and not forget about COVID and its sort of dangers of certain things, where we keep on reminding the politicians. Here, I want to say that we must learn from the military generals who always come with big mustaches on the TV shows and say that China is going to attack Pakistan. They never say that Pakistan is not dangerous, China is not dangerous, forget about. Unfortunately, in health, we always underplay the impact it has. So as a university, we must ensure that the impact of COVID is properly measured, properly analyzed, and depicted to the society. And for that, media are very important. The kind of criticism and discussions which happen in open media also had a lot of weight on what kind of social and political investments will be happening. So I think to measure the impact and bring out the, what should I say, inequities in the system and remind continuously. See why many Western countries, if you see the England's analysis of infant mortality almost for 100 years was by social class. We don't have social class infant mortality available in India. We just say, oh, it is 30, it has come down to 28, we are very happy. But what happened to the bottom per quintile? Is that infant mortality changing? Is that life expectancy increasing? Is that weight of the women or hemoglobin increasing? So if we measure that, hopefully there will be change. Second is we have to have good dialogue and continuous dialogue with the politicians, with the administrators, with the technical people who are in the decision-making positions, and show them various models. Unless you show them model, they have a fixed model of a developed world, meaning big skyscrapers, fancy roads, highways, super fast trains, etc., etc. So I think we have to have some kind of alternate model and put that forward as a way of changing, like what we can show Sweden. Now everybody will say Sweden is a small country, it has only 1 crore population, but it had amassed enough wealth to fund India for many of the things for many long years. Now they have stopped because they are saying India is enough rich, we don't need to support them.
So I would also like to add here that we've been living with infectious disease for a long time, but they have all been chronic infectious diseases. And so TB, malaria, and we've learned to live with these diseases. But as a country, I don't think this is probably the first time in 100 years or so that we are facing a pandemic where it's very acute. Okay, the numbers go up very quickly, and a majority of the population is affected. And this has been shown even in the way different countries have dealt with the pandemic. The countries that have had recent memory, not 100 years ago, but more recent memory of dealing with pandemics, when this, like the SARS pandemic, the SARS epidemic, or the swine flu, have actually done better even before the vaccine was available. So
Yeah.
Taiwan, Singapore, many of the South Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, where because this public memory was there. So when the government tells them to wear masks, they have experienced it. 20 years ago, it was really bad. So I better wear a mask now so that I don't get to that stage again. We never had this in India.
Professor Mavalankar, we have although exceeded the time that we had requested you to be with us, but can we have another 10 or 15 minutes more because
Sure,
our
sure.
audience still have a few questions.
Yeah.
In fact, Dr. Ahmed had a follow-up question. So would you like to ask that first?
Yeah, thank you, organizers, for permitting a second question. So Professor Mavalankar, my question relates to the direction India has taken in terms of prioritizing health insurance as a predominant way of covering costs for the population. And I take the example of Ayushman Bharat, which has increased the cap under which people can get care in a hospital up to 5 lakhs. But the way you beautifully explained that we have two separate parts of a sickness fund and a preventative fund. So what are your views in the direction generally we have taken? Are we doing too much in the space of health insurance, while a lot of our health infrastructure may not be adequately present to cater to many of the preventable conditions that are already there?
I think we of course need to reinvest in our healthcare infrastructure, and hopefully this pandemic has taught. We have written something about diagnostic infrastructure, that still in states like Gujarat, we don't have RT-PCR machines available in all districts, and even courts have pointed that out. So some of the infrastructure is woefully lacking, especially in the new districts which are there. I think one of our nation's problem, I think, is we don't believe in investing in maintenance. We believe in investing in new building, new things, but the old building maintenance fund, if we invest in adequate, it will pay on for a long time, because a building which is not maintained deteriorates very fast. And many of you may have engineering backgrounds, you know. First of all, public buildings are not constructed with good quality because of various reasons. And after that, we don't invest enough in maintenance. So when the 5-year planning cycles were there, I had this idea that 1 5-year plan, we should not build anything new. We should just invest that money in repairing everything we built in the last 10 or 12 5-year plans. That will not be enough. If you see rural schools, rural primary health centers, even district hospitals, in this pandemic, many hospitals were shown. They are very, very in a pathetic condition because of lack of investment. Second is, we must also invest in a modern infrastructure. These wards which we see, one ward having 40 people, 20 people, this was the modern ward which Florence Nightingale created in 1850s. This was thought to be very great advance in those times, that one nurse could look after 40 patients, because there was no nurse that time. And hospitals were like in any building. So Florence Nightingale built this, designed this ward herself. But we are still copying what Florence Nightingale, our science has gone much more. No Western country builds a ward like this. There are maximum 3 patients, 2 patients, 1 patient to a room. And that is where people don't want to go to a public hospital. Would you want to go to a public hospital for COVID treatment where everybody else in your ward is coughing and you don't know what strain the other patient has and what strain you have. So infection disease protection also means independent rooms to the patients, not this ward type. So our even thinking has not reached that level. Forget about doing it. We don't even think in that direction. So we are far off. Of course, we are moving in that direction. The other thing is, it is not only buildings, it is also human resources, quality of nurses. Till very recently, nurses were getting 15,000 rupees salary. And that is not per month. It is not enough to get a good driver. How do you get a nurse at 15,000 rupees? So our payments also have to be really re-looked at and seen how do we make it a prestigious job. I was about to write an article comparing an air hostess and a nurse. And you see air hostess get 30,000-40,000 rupees for a 2-hour flight thrice a week or 4 times a week, whereas a nurse does 12-hour duties at night and 8 hours duties or 6-hour duties in daytime by rotation and still gets 15,000 rupees. So that shows our priority of our society. So I think unless we change many of these parameters, we have a lot to catch up.
Thank you, Professor Mavalankar, and thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for your question. I would invite Professor Sonal Yadav from Ahmedabad University. She had a few thoughts and a question to ask. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mavalankar and Professor Talwadi. My question is about vaccination coverage. As we know that in India, the coverage is very slow. So is it not possible to speed up vaccination? Because enough vaccines are not available. So when we are trying to register online, we don't get slot. And related question followed up with this is also like, are we prepared for the third wave? Because we expect that third wave would be in the month of August and or September. So in second wave, there was huge demand supply gap, and there was black marketing of remdesivir drug and other. There were not enough beds available, and people say that the death was more because of lack of timely treatment rather than the disease. So are we prepared for the third wave in terms of medicines or paramedical staff or availability of beds?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the last point first, we are getting at least what we know. We are not part of government, so we can't ensure that we are there. But at least the Chief Minister has instructed the health department to make 1.5 times the preparation extra. Like if we had 14,000 cases, suppose we had 30,000, double the number of cases, we should be able to manage. That much preparation has been ordered. So if you see the number of oxygen plants, the number of beds and other things, of course, it's not easy to add beds because you need buildings. Right. And in that, but preparation is undergoing. Only the test of this thing is proof of the pudding is in eating if the third wave comes. And like Kerala, there was yesterday discussion, I talked to somebody, they said we have Kerala is still reporting 10,000 cases, some number for a long time. They're saying we are okay with that. UK is reporting 20,000 cases. They said we are okay with that. So if our health infrastructure is not overloaded, and the other side is people should not get pauperized. In the sense, I don't know if you met anybody who has paid bills for this black fungus infection. Right. Each injection was some 5,000 rupees if you got it. And that also 100 injections, 70 injections, plus the charge, plus other surgery. So anything like the Apollo or some hospitals, I don't want to name them, but they had a package of 30 lakhs. Now, how many people can afford 30 lakhs to save one person's life? So that is another issue, that we may have aggregate, everybody may be ready, but do we have the money to fight the war by everybody from our society? And anyway, so many businesses. So in some sense, it is easy to say that, yes, we are prepared to fight the war of the third wave. But when it really comes, there will be a lot of difficulty, casualty. Of course, preparation always helps. So we had in the committee suggested that we should have, and now we are seeing a strategic reserve. Like, why does Food Corporation store so much of grain in India? It is much more than what we require by any calculation. And 1/3 is rots, 1/3 is eaten by rats, some damage, but still we keep it. Why? Because we don't want to suffer famine. So similarly, if you don't want to suffer such shortage, we must have, and some countries in Europe have. If you have not seen, there's an interesting short film on Finland, how Finland was well prepared, because Finland is in border with Russia. So since Second World War, they have been storing N95 masks and PPE kits and chemical warfare equipment and everything, because they said anything will happen anytime. And all that came useful for this time. So in some sense, if we prepare well, I give this example that the army doesn't manufacture the explosives when the war starts. We keep on having our explosive factories and some things will expire. Some things will have to be destroyed. Like in Europe, there are a lot of vaccine each year, flu vaccine expires. So that type of investment we need to make ready. Of course, now in the last budget was a sleet of hand. There was not much increase in the health except the vaccination. They said water, they combined water 60,000 crores and said, oh, health ka bade itna bad gaya. That was all sham. But now they have put in this 2 new 50,000 crore package and now recently some 23,000 crore package. Of course, that has to be seen by the real experts on that, because what is really in the package, we don't know how much really will come. But hopefully people will, and given that they have removed the health minister in the middle of a pandemic, is also saying that at some level, government is very serious that this should not happen. Of course, in the vaccine, nothing much can be done except giving more and more vaccine priority. Second is this 25% private quota. Many states like Orissa has said, we don't have so many people who can buy 25% private quota vaccine. So India's poverty is such variable. In Goa, Delhi, Bombay, maybe 80% can buy private vaccine and 20% will require free vaccine. Whereas in Orissa, maybe only 5% can buy private vaccine. So that also can be recalibrated somewhat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Yadav, and thank you, Professor Mavalankar. Professor Tanavade, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask one last question as a closing question to Professor Mavalankar. In this entire pandemic and this virus, what is the one question about the COVID pandemic that has baffled you the most?
Yeah, I think this whole issue of why, one is that why it doesn't spread in the family. If we say, if you go out for 10 minutes in a shop, you can get the infection. If you go out and touch somewhere, you can get the infection. Then why all family members are not infected? That is one question which is still baffling. Second is why the poor are not so much affected, which is second one. So two answers not clear to me. And the most likely answer is it is your immunity. So it is the war between the virus and the immunity, and where immunity is less, you get the disease, or virus load is more, you get the disease. So
that is always a very dynamic equation.
Yeah.
And we hope that the virus loses and the immunity wins in every patient. And that's another thing which we're still trying to understand.
No, and that is where a lot of studies need to be done. Unfortunately, in India, because of the data secrecy, because of people's whatever, and lack of funding of research, we haven't been doing these such studies. That why suppose it is not spreading in the family,
right?
And is it subclinical infection in the family or not, etc.
Okay, I think Professor Balaji Prakash has a question.
Yes.
Balaji,
Yeah.
you can unmute and
right. Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Vivek. Professor Mavlankar, that was an excellent chat with you, both you and Vivek. I would like to thank you. Very detailed, and you've touched upon so many issues. So this reminds me, I'll just take a few minutes. This reminds me of a book that I read long time ago when I was a PhD student at ISC Bangalore. Somebody gifted me, which was sort of put together by Khushwant Singh in the days when, you know, the Britishers just left India. It was called The Sahibs Who Loved India. And in that, you know, I mean, there's so many nice stories, but there's one story of one lady who commented this way, that, you know, this country is full of such talented people, but for some reason, these guys can't get their act together. You know, and this is something, you know, a comment that sort of keeps, you know, coming back to me in, you know, I'm reminded of this comment on many occasions. So in that sense, you know, I mean, when Dr. Danish Ahmed was talking about tuberculosis, you know, I've spent a long years in, you know, talking with DBT and others. Our policies, if I see in it, they are kind of, even if the money spent on tuberculosis, etc., which is such a serious disease for a country like ours, the policies to spend even that money is so haphazard. And you know, and another thing I noticed from your talk is a very beautiful hypothesis that you came up with, saying that the importance of vitamin D versus the susceptibility to COVID, right? So, I mean, what I see is that there is something amiss here, that is a handshake between scientists or the biologists and the public health specialists such as you, right? So why is it that this continues to happen, or would this change in the future? Of course, today we see, you know, very proud to see vaccines like Covaxin and others from the private sector. Were these planned? Did these people actually talk with public health specialists? So I don't know, the thought that comes to my mind is COVID is probably over. We are learning and we're doing so many things, but how should we get prepared in the future? So how should we learn to work as biologists, as scientists, to work together with public health specialists? Can there be a better and effective handshake? So this is something I was thinking.
No, I think it's a very important point. Partly it is the way our universities are structured versus the way universities are structured abroad. The second side is that somehow our political and religious and social mindset is still not scientific enough. I sometimes joke saying the Renaissance hasn't hit India yet. I was surprised if you see on YouTube, I recently saw, and that's why I was, how many people would have seen, people means one person seeing also many times, Hanuman Chalisa. 180 crore is its viewership. 100 and more than India's population has seen in last, I don't know, 4 years they had put that. And this is one Hanuman Chalisa. I'm sure there are hundreds of Hanuman Chalisa. So in some sense, what happened in Renaissance, saying you must question, you must find the truth, you must dissect the bodies, you must know what is really happening. That unfortunately happening. The RTI and transparency. Now I was so surprised that I didn't know High Court PILs you can see sitting in your room. They are all now, Gujarat High Court is the first one to live. So I was seeing the arguments happening in the PIL on COVID every 2-3 days. And that was what was being shown. So it is happening, but we need more such collaborations, more such collaborative efforts to work with. Second is our whole independent public health schools have not developed so much as have developed. Third is our bureaucracy has not taken up more and more scientific approach. See, our main controlling people are political people who are elected, and IAS people who are really bright but generalist in that sense. We don't have a technical bureaucracy except in some departments have. So we have to think in this milieu, how do we bring in the technical aspects of care? Second is we don't realize I never heard America's health minister talk during this. I don't know even who is America's health minister now, in spite of all this pandemic. So Fauci talks. In Britain, of course, Prime Minister talks, sometimes Health Secretary talks, British Health Minister. So in some sense, our political people are taking too much of operational decisions rather than policy decisions, and getting into too many micro level, which should be actually managed by technocrats or bureaucrats at whatever level. So those kinds of changes. Second is, in Sweden, we had a collaborative project. So that's why I want to tell you a little bit about it. There's a very interesting government funded mechanism by which the technical people can talk to the politicians. Each political party has a government paid health advisor. And that health advisor is either a doctor or midwife or a nurse or somebody. So he's a technical people, but he is advisor to each party, one advisor. And that is through that person, the professional organizations, the doctor, the midwife, the nurses, the scientists, and there may be scientific advisors similarly to each political party. So we have to think of what mechanisms, because see, new health minister has come. How does he learn? He can't go to a class. He can't attend anything. Now, all the people who brief him are the people. So can we think of such mechanisms that technical people, we have a chief economic advisor. Manmohan Singh himself was economist. उनको भी economic advisor, उनको economic advisory council भी है. But we don't have a health advisory council. We don't have a health advisor. So in some sense, health as an issue, or we have scientific advisor, but we don't have scientific advisory council to the prime minister. There's one person. So we have to have such mechanisms built up, which will build the technical side of our governance mechanisms.
All right. So thank you, Professor Mavlankar. That was a very, very interesting conversation. And as I said in the beginning of this conversation, that a biologist, so to answer your question, Balaji, I think this is a good example of a biologist talking to a public health expert and epidemiologist on a forum that is organized by a management school.
Sure.
And these sort of conversations, I think we need to have more and more such conversations. And so I'm also grateful to the Amrit Modi School of Management and the conversation series for kind of organizing this. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And once again, thank you, Professor Mavlankar, for
thank you
spending your time with us. And I think we had a very interesting conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Mavlankar. And thank you, Professor Tanavade, for being in the conversation with Professor Mavlankar. And I also thank our audience for their questions and for staying with us for 2 hours. And we look forward to having you next Saturday with us on our next webinar. So we'll call it a day, and thanks a lot. Good evening and good night to all of you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.